So just briefly, my name is Ciaran O'Riordan. I work for Free Software Foundation Europe. I'm the Brussels-based activist. I started working for Free Software Foundation Europe during the software patents campaigning in 2004, and so I've been working for them since then. And I've generally worked on projects that need community interaction. So I worked on GPL version 3 after software patents, and I've worked on a few other directives about patents and about copyright. And in general, I try to make these processes available to the community so that more people can get involved, because one person in Brussels can't actually do enough work to solve all these problems, believe it or not. So the more important goal is to try and get other people active in these issues as well. So I was asked to talk today about software patents and DRM, which are two topics that don't really have anything in common. So I think the main idea was that I have to talk about the bad things that somebody should be working on. So that's what I'm going to do. So these bad things, they're bad and somebody has to work on them, because unlike software development, we can't leave these things to the market. Free software has started off as a community project, and it was done by volunteers for a long time. But now the software that has been developed is so valuable and so useful that there are a lot of companies who employ thousands of programmers to do software development work. So this is something that we can rely on them to do, because whether a company develops the software or an individual develops the software, the functionality will be the same, and once it's free software, we can always change it to our needs anyway. But the problem is that we can't leave everything to the companies. We can't allow them to, we can't let them take over the work that we were doing, because there is other work such as advertising and awareness and political lobbying that can't be done by the companies, because we don't always share the same values. So what we have at the moment is we used to have a large amount of the software being developed by free software supporters, developers who agreed with the free software movement. But now we have, that number of developers has grown, but the number of companies involved has grown a lot more. And some of the companies are good, and some of the companies are not so good. Some of them agree with our philosophy, but many don't. But because we have a license, the GNU General Public License, that requires everyone to play by a certain set of rules, it's okay to collaborate with people who don't share our views and our mission, because they're bound by the GPL and their contributions are as good as anyone else's contributions to software. So briefly, this has probably been defined yesterday, but briefly the definition that we use for free software is that software is free software if each user can use the software for any purpose they want, can view the source code if they choose and make modifications if they think modifications are necessary. Each user can copy the software and give it to their friends, their co-workers, their colleagues, and each user can distribute modified versions. Now, when you're explaining free software to people who are not software developers, this doesn't always seem very relevant, because people say, well, you know, I can use Mozilla Firefox, and if I want, I can download 9 million lines of C and C++ code, and that's no good to me, because for most people, software development isn't something they're going to do. And even for software developers, most software developers who use Mozilla Firefox have never looked at the source code of Mozilla Firefox, because nobody has time to look at all the source code of all the applications they're using. So you have to think of these freedoms not just from an individual point of view, that you can help yourself if you had infinite time, but also that as from a community point of view, these freedoms, when everyone has them, not just you, they allow the community to take control of the software whenever necessary. So, for example, we have many distributions of free software, and some of them include proprietary software, which the free software movement doesn't like, but we don't have to be able to rewrite the entire operating system or audit the entire code base to produce a purely free software version, because we have distributions like GNU Sense, which they only had to make small modifications in a small number of packages, and they have to remove some other proprietary packages. And so in this way, two people were able to take an entire GNU Linux distribution, which takes nine CDs to distribute, and they're able to remove all the software they didn't like and produce their customized version. So this is the work that they did then is then usable by everyone. So those are two programmers and they were able to use the freedoms, but the benefit isn't just for their benefit, it's for everyone's benefit. So then when the community has control of the software that everyone uses for their computers, the end result is that society can decide what direction we want technology to evolve in. So this means that individuals have control over how they use their computer, what other software they're going to install. Compatibility is something that can be controlled by the community. You also have more control over privacy, because we see more and more networked applications are collecting data about the users of computers and sending this data to private corporations. And well, there's very little knowledge or little control over what happens to this data afterwards. You know, maybe it will be used for harassment, or maybe it will be used for discrimination. Nobody can tell. But with free software, generally, if there is a feature that invades people's privacy, one developer can remove that feature, and then every user can benefit from that one developer's work. And then on the administrative side, governments and schools can also use free software to have complete control over their own national security and their own sovereignty and autonomy, and to teach ethical behavior in schools. So some key points about understanding software patents are that the first is that software patents cover individual ideas. They're not like copyright. They don't cover a software package. They cover one feature. They cover search and replace, or they cover sorting lines, or they cover one specific idea. And in many fields of development, for example, developing cars or developing physical products or even chemical formula, the number of ideas that end up in a product can be fairly limited. In a car, it might reach 5,000 ideas in total for a car which has cost millions and millions to create, to develop. However, a software package written by one individual can easily contain 1,000 ideas. So software packages end up containing a lot more ideas, and any one of these can be patented. So when there is a patent on an idea, the result is that using that idea is illegal unless you have permission from the patent holder. So the way software patents then harm software development is that first off, they add the general risk to software development. They add the risk that you might infringe a patent, and you might have to go to court. You might even be found guilty of infringement. So there are these potential risks and legal costs. And these are the sort of things that don't really worry large companies who have a legal department and have a large legal defense fund. But for individuals and for small companies, and even for medium-sized companies, these risks are a big problem. And the second harm is that specifically software patents inhibit the development of useful software, because firstly because they're often applied to standards or other file formats or other ways of communicating data, which is essential for computer users. And the second reason is because a patent isn't automatically enforced. A patent might be applied for and granted, and then it might sit idle doing nothing for 10 years. And as soon as somebody has an invention that becomes profitable, then the patent holder can come along with their patent and say, oh, actually, you can't continue to distribute that software unless you have my permission, and I require a certain amount of money or a certain percentage or certain terms and conditions. So in that way, it blocks useful software. And then also the time frame is completely out of sync with software development, because when you apply for a software patent, the application remains secret for 1.5 years. So during 1.5 years, if you infringe that patent, you can still be found guilty of infringement. However, you never had an opportunity to even know the patent existed. So these are things that are incompatible. Now, it's worth noting that these two problems are the basis of the other problems caused by software patents, but these aren't problems that are specific to free software. They're things that free software developers care about because they inhibit the general freedom of people to develop code and to participate in the development and distribution of code. But these problems also are also faced by proprietary software companies as well, which is something we have to think of as a positive thing, because this means that proprietary software companies can also, or will also, help us in the fight against software patents. So the current status is that we have legislation that has been in place for decades called the European Patent Convention, which defines what is patentable and what isn't. And the legislation is reasonably clear. It says that software is not patentable. However, the patent offices have been practically ignoring the legislation, and they've been approving software patents anyway. And then when these software patents when they are approved, they don't actually have legal weight until a court decides, yes, that is a valid patent, or no, it isn't. So we've had a few court cases in Europe so far, and sometimes the court has said software is patentable, and sometimes they've said it isn't patentable. Sorry, the question already.
They may not have legal weight until the court decides, but most of what patents are used for is not actually going to court and forcing a decision, but telling a company about, we might go to court, and if you pay us money, we won't.
Exactly.
So just the existence of the patent is a threat, and the threat is often worth more than any court decision.
Exactly. So this is the problem is that the patents, they're not very reliable in court, so the patent holders don't go to court. They simply go to people and claim the patent is valid, and sometimes the way they do it is they say, I have a patent, and if you want to use it, you can give me €5,000. And then the person who is attacked by the patent will go to their lawyer and say, is this valid? And the lawyer will say, well, it'll take me a few days to figure that out because I have to check the case law. If you pay me €8,000, I'll check whether it's valid or not. And so the person who's asked for 5,000, they end up paying the 5,000 sometimes, or sometimes just out of fear that the patent might be valid, they pull the product completely and they have to find a new way to develop their software. So we have these patents that are maybe not legally valid, but there are about 80,000 of them existing, and they're being used as business tools or as intimidation tools anyway. So the legislation that we have, it says that programs for computers shall not be considered patentable as such. And what happens is the European Patent Office then has taken this wording and has decided that as such means as programs for computers. And so they've said, okay, programs for computers are not patentable if you apply for it as a program for a computer. But if you use a different wording, if you apply for it as a computer implemented invention, then that's fine. So basically they're saying that this exclusion doesn't have any substance, it's purely a formality. And the problem with this is that if they want to say this exclusion is just a formality, then that means all the exclusions are just formalities. So ways of organizing data, ways of presenting data, ways of doing mental acts and scheduling, these things would all be patentable. So we had a big battle about this all across Europe, and eventually in June 2005 the battle was ended with it was a draw really. There had been a proposal to make software patents really exist, and after 7 years of fighting against that proposal, the proposal was dropped. So this was a massive amount of work that was put in, and in the end the result was we maintained the status quo. So the unclear situation that we had before still exists now. The software patents are still being granted by the EPO and are still being rejected sometimes in court and upheld sometimes in court. And since June 2005, there have been a few different efforts to try and make software patents valid in Europe again. The people who are pushing for software patents they've tried to insert software patents into other pieces of legislation, and they've tried to reconfigure the way that software patent rulings are given out so that software patents would be enforced by the courts. But these attempts haven't been successful so far, and we can usually tell that they're not going to be successful. However, if they keep on trying, then eventually they're going to get lucky, and eventually they're going to get something that does work. So we're restarting our software patent work at this point. It's been ongoing for the last 3 years, but it's been at a low level. But in November 2009, there's a high chance that there will be a new proposal for legislation about patentability. And the reason for this is that the European Commission has said that they won't propose any new legislation during their current term. And the term ends in November 2009, and the problem hasn't gone away. So there's a good chance that when the new Commission does come in, they're going to propose something. So looking back at what we did across almost 10 years of working on this, There are a few ways we can improve our campaigning for next time. One thing we have to do is we have to rebuild the very negative media image that software patents had in 2005. Because in 2005, in general, the technology journalists were behind us, and they were very critical of the companies that were applying for software patents. And in general, it was fairly easy to get support from the journalists. However, the topic has disappeared, some of the journalists have changed jobs, and now we almost have to start from scratch. So to avoid having to start this in November 2009, we should really start this very soon, so that when the new commission does come in, software patents will already have a negative image again. One possible thing we should highlight for the Commission is that every patent is a piece of bureaucracy, because the European Commission loves talking, at least, about reducing bureaucracy and reducing red tape. So every patent is something that a company had to pay lawyers to do, and might have to pay lawyers to go to court about. And every time someone's accused of patent infringement, there's more and more bureaucracy that doesn't actually create anything directly. So maybe we should try and build a link between patents and bureaucracy. Another thing is that the terminology we use might have to change, because we always talked about software patents, and we always campaigned no software patents and stop software patents. And the problem was the European Commission used the European Patent Office's definition of programs for computers, and so they basically always said that they agreed with us. However, software patents don't exist anyway, so we'd say no software patents, and they'd say yes, of course, and that would be the end of the discussion. So it was always a very difficult thing to talk about. So this is something we still need to use that term, because so much effort has been put into it that we shouldn't abandon it. But we also need to develop a more detailed set of terminology so that we can have a discussion, so we can really pin down the European Commission so they can't slip out whenever we try and talk to them about it. But there's another question.
More comments. Another argument, at least from a free software point of view, is that patents are a deal made for a completely different kind of economy. The deal was basically, you have this awesome secret, and we want you to publish the secret. So we give you a monopoly right, something that is inherently bad, but in exchange for the monopoly right, we get you to publish the secret, and now we have all this documentation about it, which is good. So it is a quid pro quo. Whereas in free software, there is no secret in the first place, it is already published, and yet we get nothing. But we still get the problems of other people having patents. So basically, here's a bunch of people that already give all the advantages of the patent system, and why should they suffer all the problems of it?
Yeah, and this is another change that's happened, is that in 2002, 2003, when we were doing lobbying, we didn't mention free software very much. We always talked about the more general freedom to participate in software development, because in 2002, 2003, free software wasn't something that the politicians knew about. But in 2005 that changed, and now it's changed even further. So now, when we do our lobbying now, free software is something that we should, it's a lot easier to use it as an example, because a lot of the politicians do know what free software is, and it's something that we can use as a argument against software patents. But we do have to keep in mind that it's not a free software problem, because this is a mistake that was made sometimes in the media. They're talking about free software having this problem and proprietary software not having this problem. But actually, in ways, free software suffers less from the problem, because with proprietary software, if there's one patent, then the whole program is illegal. However, with free software, if there's one patent, then the program can be modified, and that one feature can be removed, and the remainder is still perfectly valid. So there are pluses and minuses. But yeah, for our discussions with the Commission, we need a more detailed terminology, and we also need some concrete examples as well. So we also have to look at our legislation. In 2003, we used this term "forces of nature" to define whether something should be patentable or not. We said that if it involves a new teaching in forces of nature, then it could be patentable, and if it didn't, it wouldn't be patentable. And this was our way of defining a line between software and mechanical patents, or chemistry patents, etc. Then in 2005, we used a different term. We used applied natural science. But the problem is these terms are very difficult to define exactly. it's important to choose the right term. However, we have to go further than that. We also have to make some specific definitions about data processing, or about information communication, or about displaying information, or we have to think of other ways to define exactly what we mean, because forces of nature, when you get down to certain levels, it's very difficult to decide whether emitting audio waves, is that a force of nature or not. Some people will say it is, and therefore MP3 should be patentable by our definition, and some people will say it's not. So we have to go beyond the simple picking the right term definition. We have to go into a more detailed definition in the law as well. And another possibility we could do is we could, instead of focusing on the definition, we could focus on exclusions. We could have, for example, interoperability is never, implementing interoperable software is never a patent infringement. So if that exclusion existed, even if software patents were valid, you would still be able to implement different file formats and communication formats, because even though the patent is in the field, implementing interoperability would not be a patent infringement. So that's another way we can also get the legislation to help us. So one thing we kind of got distracted on sometimes in 2005 was talking about the more general idea of fighting the patent system as a whole. And people would look at pharmaceutical patents and the injustice that's happening in Africa, and people would look at the patents on car manufacturers and how sometimes they're being abused, and sometimes people would decide that the whole patent system needs a full review. But this was something that was problematic during our lobbying, because when the legislation was proposed, we weren't asked what would you like to do with the whole system. We were asked, the legislation was about the definition of software and the exclusion of software. So when we talk about getting rid of the entire patent system, not only are we off topic, but we're also we fall into other problems, such as violating the TRIPS agreement. The TRIPS agreement is an international agreement that says that some things should be patentable and some things shouldn't, and it's not very clear. But it does say that, for example, pharmaceuticals should be patentable, and it doesn't say that software should be patentable. So with the TRIPS agreement, there is no problem lobbying against software patents. But with the TRIPS agreement, if we want to lobby against all patents, then that is a problem. Then we're asking the governments to go back and renegotiate that as well. So I think it's important to focus on software, to stay within these agreements, but also because if we focus on a larger topic, such as unjust patents or patents that we don't like, then we get more enemies. For everything we fight against, we have a new set of enemies. So if we fight against software patents and pharmaceutical patents, then we have to fight against the software industry, well, the proprietary software industry, or even the subset of mega corporations. Plus, we also have to fight against the pharmaceutical mega corporations, which is an enemy we don't need to add to our problem. So we need to make it clear that we don't have an opinion on pharmaceutical patents. We're not lobbying for them, and we're not lobbying against them. And we don't have an opinion on the patents of braking systems in cars. So if a braking system in a car, the anti-lock braking system, it uses software, and for us we think that's okay, because as long as the innovation is in the hardware, it's a new way of slowing down a car, then that's no problem for us, because we're not arguing that everyone should be free to develop cars. We're arguing that everyone should be free to develop software. So for us, we have to be clear that we don't want to fight against the automobile industry, if that's not actually important to us. So that's something we have to maybe be more clear about in our media work and our lobbying next time. So a topic that came up again and again was, why is software different? Why do we think software is so special that it should be excluded or protected against patents? And this is a silly question, really, because software isn't the only thing that's excluded from patents. Mathematics is excluded from patents, and writing a shopping list is excluded from patents, and writing a book is excluded from patents. A book can be very technical and it can be very innovative, but it's still excluded from patents. So we're arguing that software is just like writing a book. It's something that most people will never do, but everyone can do it if they like. It's something that it's within the grasp of everyone. So we have to focus on software, but also we have to remember to focus on free software, because some of the times when we were doing our lobbying, we noticed that the small and medium enterprises were they were a very good ally for us in the fight against software patents, and they also would be harmed by software patents, and the politicians found it easy to understand the arguments that they were making. So sometimes we started using the same arguments and reminding the politicians about the problems the software patents would create for small and medium enterprises. However, this is a temporary solution. This can cause problems, because then if the politicians think that the only thing they have to protect is small and medium enterprises, then they might create an exclusion for SMEs, and they might create maybe a fund to help SMEs apply for and defend themselves against software patents, which would end up creating even more software patents. But the politicians would think that it's a solution, because if we just say protect the SMEs all the time, then the MEPs will just protect the SMEs. So this is something we have to keep in mind. We have to remember to tell the politicians that it's not just about SMEs, it's also about free software, and it's about the general freedom of people to be a software developer. So recently there has been talk in the European Patent Office, well, recently in the last 2 years, about the patent examiners being overloaded. So they have I think they get about 8 hours to examine each patent, and they can approve or reject it. They generally don't have enough time to actually do enough research into prior art and to decide whether this is valid or not. And they're always complaining about their workload, and there's a backlog. I've heard that sometimes you apply for a patent and it can take 5 years for the patent to be granted or rejected. But a lot of the time people say, well, to reduce their load, what we have to do is we have to make it stricter, the application process stricter. And so the criteria for patentability are, it has to be innovative, it has to be useful, and it has to be in an area that is patentable. And so people say, well, let's increase the requirement of being innovative, which is very difficult, because then you're asking people to make a judgment call on, if I have a new feature in this software, well, is it innovative? Is it really useful? Is it a big change? Is it big enough to deserve a patent? So this is still a subjective issue, and it's something that it's very difficult to reject patents based on this criteria. So I think it's much better if we could clarify the subject matter. If we could draw the line and say software is not patentable, then that would be a very clear way. That would be a very clean way of reducing the workload for the patent examiners. So our goal and our mission is not to reduce the workload of the patent examiners, but if that's what they want and something we want is compatible, then it makes sense to inform them that our solution is good for them as well. So what's happened recently in software patents is that FFII have launched the Stop Software Patents petition. So this is a new petition which is basically calling on the politicians to bring in legislation that protects against software patents. And there also been the European patent examiners actually went on strike recently to protest against the European Patent Office using an overly broad definition of what is patentable. So this is another thing that maybe we can profit from this. Maybe we can actually get support from the European Patent Office examiners, not the management. The management, they want everything to be patentable, everything under the sun made by man. But the employees are actually against the management, it seems. So maybe we can get support there as well. So that's why, with November 2009 coming up, that's why this topic is going to come back, and over the next few months there will be new initiatives and new more discussion in the press. Sorry, there's one.
Yeah, well, I have a question. You didn't speak about the economic value of patents, and if it's positive or negative for software, and maybe there's a topic there as well for the EC, because well, some of the decisions for open source are also made on economic value.
That's true, but what I'm hoping is that there are certain large companies that are also against software patents, and for them, they're the ones that feel the economic impact the most. So it would make sense for them to make that argument, and I think that's something we can rely on companies to look after their own interests. So I would usually tend to, if something will be done by companies anyway, then let them do it. And the thing that we can't rely on companies to do, the things that the community has to do, that, that's what we have to focus our limited resources on. That's usually the way. But the economic arguments are, there are plenty of economists from Europe that have published papers saying that software patents don't make any sense. And even the Federal Trade Commission in the USA published a very good review of their entire patent system. And it was a 350-page report with about 20 pages about software patents. And the 20 pages, it was a laundry list of problems that the patents cause in the field of software. So this is, there are plenty of good economic arguments we can rely on. And that's, like I say that we don't normally focus on the economic arguments. However, sometimes we do have to respond to the question, will the economy collapse if we do X? So it is always good to at least have a knowledge, a latent knowledge of these things to respond to those questions. So that's important, all right. Okay, so that was software patents. Then I'm going to talk, well, I won't not talk at the same length, but just briefly about DRM. DRM is a much vaguer topic. There are various definitions, and you'll hear some people saying that DRM has good uses and bad uses, and some people will say yes, but those good uses, they're not actually part of the real definition of DRM. But in general, DRM is a way of securing information against certain uses, and it can be used by an individual to protect their own data, which is a very rare case. More normally, it's used by a third party to protect, to limit, to restrict the user. So this is a way of giving the user a piece of software that has a limited set of functionality, and then giving the user data that can only be used by that piece of software. So the DRM, I think a few years ago, everyone thought that it was just going to appear and it was going to be ubiquitous and it was going to be part of the next version of Windows, and suddenly everything was going to be locked down at DRM. And that didn't happen, and then all of a sudden the music companies started producing music that didn't use DRM, and so there was a bit array of hope. But we can't rely on that, because I think the next wave of DRM is going to come from devices that are locked down, because a lot of companies realize that you can't lock down software on someone's computer so easily, but you can reliably lock down a device that you sell them. So the important thing to remember is that DRM and free software are completely incompatible. There are a few free software DRM projects, or they're so-called, actually they're actually always called open source DRM projects for whatever reason. But the reason that this is completely incompatible is that the whole purpose of free software is to give every individual and the community as a whole control over what the software does. And the whole purpose of DRM is to prevent the user of a certain piece of information or a certain piece of music from being able to fully control what they do with that music. So these two purposes are completely incompatible. So when we see talk about free software DRM, then we have to be very careful, because it's either not really DRM or it's not really free software. So I mentioned the devices are going to be the problem, and this is happening already, because more and more the computing that we do is being done less on the desktop and even less on laptops, and more on devices that are in our pockets and in our bags. These handheld games, these music players, the new third generation mobile phones. This is what we're using now to take pictures and to share pictures and to send emails and to read the web, and increasingly these tablets will be used, and often these devices are a lot more locked down than desktop computers are. These devices are sometimes it's impossible to change the software on them at all, but this is the way that this is the environment we have to consider for the next 10 years or 20 years. So, for example, the earlier iPods, you could buy the early iPods and take the iPod software off and put a fantastic free software project called Rockbox on the iPod. And there are still many other devices you can put Rockbox onto. But with the recent iPods, the firmware has been encrypted, so the Rockbox developers don't have any chance to understand what the software would have to do, so they can't make Rockbox work on the newer iPods. So this is something you have to be very careful, because I actually got a gift of one of these, and it's gathering dust. I can't play any of my OGG files on it. It won't run free software, so I can't use it. So we have the recent iPods, and then other Apple things like the iPhone. They have a complete you have to ask Apple for permission to run any new software on the iPhone. So Apple they have complete control over the software that does run on it, and they have a kill switch as well to stop any program they don't like from running, even if they've already approved it previously. And then the TiVo and mobile phones are other examples of software being used that is it's always proprietary software is being used, or in some ways it's locked down to prevent the user from doing what they want to do. So in general, the worry for the next 20 years is that free software evolved in a system where everyone could modify their computers, and we all had programmable computers. The computer it processed any data you put into it, and so you could put any operating system on your computer. The next generation might use locked down devices that you can't program. And so with the next generation, we might have devices that, well, even if you're a programmer, you still can't do anything. So we might have a generation of non-programmers, and this will be very difficult to have free software in that environment. So there are some projects that are very successful actually already, and they're really important for the future of free software. And so OpenMoko, the telephone, is one, Rockbox, which I mentioned, and another iPod Linux. These are firmware that you can use for your digital MP3 player, well, your digital music player. And Rockbox works on many different devices. And they actually sometimes even have features in them that the default firmware doesn't have. So you end up upgrading your software by throwing out the software you got with the device and putting Rockbox on. So Myth TV is a way of capturing the signals that you could display on your television, but instead display it on through a computer. And there are also various projects to have completely free software laptops. So this problem is only really started in the last few years, and we still have to get organized on it. We have to start using our market power more carefully, because we have hundreds of millions now users of free software, and potentially a lot of people who know the issues about software freedom. However, there's very little coordination, very little organization to support devices that are only use free software, and to reject devices that don't allow free software. There's also a debate sometimes about, well, when does it become important? Should I have free software on my watch? Should I have free software on my telephone? Where's the line between the two? So it's very difficult to draw the line. One way to draw the line would be network capable. When something is network capable, maybe then it should have free software on it. Another definition would be to say that when you can install new software on it, or when anyone can install new software on the device, then if it's important enough for the manufacturer to install new software, then it's important enough for you to be able to install new software. So these are two ways, but in general, where the line is drawn isn't the big problem. The big problem is that these devices are locked down in the majority of cases. So in general, I mentioned we have there are maybe 100 million, 200 million users of free software in the world, but in general, most users of free software don't know much about free software, or don't even know that they're using free software. So it's very difficult for people to value the freedoms that they're losing in these devices when they don't even know they have the freedoms in the first place. So just a quick rundown of FSFE's that's the end of the DRM section, but so just a quick rundown of the work that we do. I was very pleased recently to see the Samba developers apparently are very happy with the documentation and the cooperation that Microsoft have been giving them as a result of the antitrust case in the EU. And this was a project that FSFE worked on for about 5 years, and it was a lot of work, a lot of very difficult work, a lot of filing briefs and court appearances, and a lot of the time it wasn't very public work, because when you have a meeting with the Commission to advise them about how to ensure free software benefits, you generally can't walk out of the meeting and write a blog entry and tell everyone about what happened. So, and the other thing is it's a very specific topic, so it's difficult sometimes to get media attention and to get community interest in something that is being handled at such a high level. But apparently now the documentation that has been published is now very useful to Samba, so we're really happy to hear that. So we worked on the OXML, as many organizations did recently. We worked on GPL version 3. That was about 2 years of work, and our specific role in that was to enable the community to participate in the the drafting process. So we organized some events, we produced a lot of transcripts, a lot of translations, we published articles, and generally tried to make it easier for the community to discuss the topics that were important by having explanations and having easy to find information, just to make the whole process more accessible and involve the community as much as possible. So then we have a legal network that we've been building up for almost 2 years, and that works on best practices of companies within that use free software, and it does some GPL enforcement, and it does the legal work, and also it gives legal advice as well to FSFE. Of course, as you can see, we do event attendance. We have to keep awareness up in that way as well. We do UN lobbying, which was one of the first projects that we got involved in FSFE, and it was a strange place to start. But the reason we did that was because the president of FSFE, Gerard Grieve, he just has a talent for this type of work. He's a natural diplomat, and talking with the people in the UN, in WIPO, in the World Summit of the Information Society, it's something he does very well. And so this was a project that FSFE worked on, and again, it's something that isn't very visible. It's not covered by the mainstream media. It's not generally a topic on Slashdot. It's not of very wide interest. However, what happens is the decisions that are taken at the UN level and the WTO level and the WIPO level, these trickle down. They come to the European Parliament afterward, and then the European Parliament makes a new directive, and then they come to the member states of the EU. So, for example, software patents is something that started, you could say, with the TRIPS agreement, and the EUCD, which is the European version of the DMCA, also started with an agreement at the global level. Another directive about criminalizing copyright infringement was also justified based on a World Trade Organization agreement. So these agreements are all taken with very little oversight and very little discussion in the national newspapers or even within the national governments, and they're taken at the global level. And then when it comes to the European Parliament, we point out that something's a really bad idea, and the members of the Parliament say, well, it was already agreed 5 years ago. There was nothing we can do about it now. You should have been working on it 5 years ago. So we're working on it now. So hopefully in 5 years' time, nothing will happen, and nobody will notice that nothing happened. But the reason will be that somebody did some work at the UN level. So then, we do the EU lobbying as well, and we do some community building. The main community tool we're using now is fsfe.org. That's our fellowship website, and there's a blogging software and there's a calendar, and there are various pieces of software there, and they're all going to disappear in a few months' time and be replaced by much better software. So things will change on fsfe.org, but the blogging is already in place and it's being used, and there's event notification and things like that. We also have mailing lists. We have a mailing list for the Benelux area, which is an English-speaking list. So that's fsfe-bnl at fsfeurope.org. And then we have a general European discussion mailing list as well, discussion at fsfeurope.org. And hopefully we'll have a wiki soon on fsfe.org. So I mentioned awareness is key. We have 100 million users of free software, and recently I've heard a lot of stories of somebody's 13-year-old niece going to somebody's house and discovering the computer is running slowly, and she says, "Oh, you should install Firefox." And so we have this level of people. We have people of all walks of life using free software. And they have no idea that it's free software, and they've never thought of what rights software users should have. And so it would be really great if free software packages included in the About menu or in the Help menu a link or a document explaining what is free software and why is this important. And that's just something I looked for recently, and I couldn't find. If you're just a user of GNU Linux, how do you actually find out? How do you learn about free software? So that's one thing. That we need an aware community, because we need this activist community to do lobbying about software patents, because if 10,000 people hear about the issue, then 2 people will be interested enough to actually decide that they're going to work on this. And so we need to maximize the awareness of the user community so that we can have an activist community as well. And one way, the most simple way, is the terminology free software and GNU Linux. These are things that take an extra 1 second a few dozen times per week, but by using these terms you can build a link between the software and the philosophy, and it at least gives us a chance to have a larger community that is aware and might work on these issues. So, almost finished. Free Software Foundation Europe, I mentioned the work we're doing. Most of the funding that we get is from the memberships. The fellowship program is a membership where you pay an annual subscription, and this is the way we generate most of our funds. Being funded by the community is really important to us because we want to be financially independent from any particular companies or from anyone who doesn't have the community's interest at heart. And the FSFE it's always focusing on political work. We don't do software development, and the reason is because free software is now developed by so many companies. There are so many thousands of developers working on free software that for us to contribute our limited resources to software development would be a bad use of the funding. There are very few people who are doing political work, and so with the money we do have, we fund political work. Okay, so that's everything I had to say. So as I mentioned, if you would support Free Software Foundation Europe, that would be very useful. And also, if you can also tell other people to support Free Software Foundation Europe, we're trying to make the community as big as possible and as strong as possible. So donating is one way, and joining FSFE.org is another way. And then as well as supporting FSFE is very important, but the other important thing is to get active yourselves and to coordinate with people, because when I go to countries, I often hear about people, certain government offices using free software, or one school giving out DVDs with GNU Linux on the DVD. Or I hear about a lot of different actions, but a lot of the time the people don't know actually why did that action happen, who started that, and so there's sometimes there's a lack of coordination between the people who are interested in free software in a country. So we have the Benelux mailing list there, and we have the general European discussion mailing list. So if people want to get active and be coordinated, it's recommended that you join these lists, and you might even find people who will help the work you're doing. So I'm going to close on that note. Now I've seen the next speaker, I think just came into the room, so I probably don't have time for questions, or at most I have time for one. Is there somebody who can tell me if I do or not? No? Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much, and well, I'll be hanging around for a while if anyone wants to ask me questions personally.